Jax's revenge domain.
The moment I reached across that mahogany table, Patricia decided I didn't belong there. She looked at my outstretched hand, then at the single white rose I'd brought for Dad's portrait hanging behind her chair, and smiled the kind of smile that invites everyone else to laugh along. "We don't shake hands with outsiders at family meetings," she said. The reaction was immediate. My brother Tommy snorted. My cousin Eddie covered his mouth. Uncle Dermot, Dad's business partner for 40 years, just looked down at his papers. The lawyer's recording device sat there on the table, red light blinking steady. I didn't pull my hand back, not right away. "Let her see exactly what she'd just done. I'm here as required by the will," I said, keeping my voice level. Patricia leaned back in Dad's old chair like she owned it, which until about 5 minutes from now she thought she did. "Then stand where you're told. This meeting is for family. My name is Max Sullivan, and I'm 48 years old. 15 years ago, I made a choice that split this family right down the middle. I walked away from Sullivan Construction to serve my country in the Navy. Dad wasn't happy about it then, called it abandoning the family legacy. Said Grandpa Seamus didn't build this company with his bare hands so his grandson could run off and play sailor. But I had my reasons, good ones. The drive up to the family estate that morning had brought back memories I'd spent years trying to forget. Rolling through the Connecticut hills, where I used to hunt with Dad before everything went wrong. Past the elementary school where Tommy and I got into fights defending the Sullivan name when other kids said we were just construction trash with money. The estate itself hadn't changed much. Same stone columns Dad had installed when the company landed its first $1 million highway contract. Same circular driveway where he taught me to drive stick shift in his old Ford pickup. The trucks in the parking lot were newer now, cleaner, but they still carried the Sullivan Construction logo that Grandpa had sketched on a bar napkin in 1962. Walking into that conference room was like stepping back into a life I'd chosen to leave behind. The same leather chairs where I'd sat as a kid during school holidays, listening to Dad and Uncle Dermot argue about job sites and labor contracts. The same view of the equipment yard where massive earth movers sat like sleeping giants between jobs. But the people around that table weren't the same, not anymore. Patricia had married Dad 10 years ago, 2 years after Mom died from cancer. Back then, she seemed like she genuinely cared about him, helped him through the grief, got him back on his feet. I was stationed in Norfolk then, couldn't make it home much. By the time I realized what was happening, she'd already moved into Mom's house, taken over Mom's seat at the family table. Tommy had been different back then too, before the money got to his head. Before he started seeing Patricia as his ticket to Easy Street instead of the woman who was slowly erasing our mother's memory from every room in that house. I said, "Stand where you're told," Patricia repeated, her voice sharp enough to cut glass. I lowered my hand on my own terms and took the empty chair near the end of the table. The laughter died down, but you could still feel it hanging in the air like smoke from a house fire. Uncle Dermot finally looked up from his papers. His eyes met mine for just a second, and I saw something there I hadn't expected. Relief, maybe, or recognition. Like he'd been waiting for this moment as long as I had. "Let's proceed," Patricia said, already turning toward the presentation screen mounted on the wall. Charts and graphs filled the screen. Financial projections, expansion plans, government contract bids. Numbers that represented the sweat and blood of 800 working families who depended on Sullivan Construction for their livelihoods. I waited until the first slide appeared. Let her get comfortable. Let everyone in that room think they knew how this meeting was going to go. "There's one thing you should know before you continue," I said. Her head turned slowly, annoyed at the interruption. "If you're refusing to shake a Navy veteran's hand at a family succession meeting," I said, "then by tomorrow morning, this company won't be yours anymore." The silence that followed was different from the laughter. Heavier, more dangerous. Then Tommy scoffed, trying to break the tension. "Mac, come on. You've been gone 15 years. 22 months, 3 weeks, 2 days, I said. "That's how long Dad has been gone, and that's how long I've been waiting for this meeting." The numbers were burned into my memory like coordinates from a military operation. Dad had died on a Tuesday in February, massive heart attack while reviewing blueprints for a new highway expansion project. I was in the middle of the Arabian Sea when the call came through ship's communications. By the time I made it back to Connecticut, the funeral was over, and Patricia was already talking about maintaining stability and ensuring continuity of operations. Uncle Dermot looked up from his papers for the first time since I'd entered the room. His weathered face showed 40 years of construction site sun and cigarette smoke, but his eyes were sharp as ever. Patricia's voice took on that tone she used when she wanted everyone to remember who was in charge. Waiting for what, exactly? I reached into my jacket and pulled out a sealed envelope, set it on that polished table where everyone could see Dad's handwriting across the front. For the family lawyer to open Dad's real will, the room temperature seemed to drop 10 degrees. "That's not possible," Patricia said, but her voice had lost some of its authority. We probated his will months ago. The lawyer, Jim Hendricks, cleared his throat. Dad had used Jim for 30 years, ever since the company's first major lawsuit over a bridge project that went sideways. Jim was the kind of lawyer who still wore suspenders and kept his word like it was made of steel. There was a second will, Jim said carefully, filed separately, with specific instructions for when it should be opened. Which was? Tommy asked. For the first time that morning, he looked genuinely concerned instead of just annoyed, when the family demonstrated their true character in his absence. I'd spent 2 decades in the Navy learning to follow orders, trust the chain of command, and believe that missions would make sense eventually. Turns out Dad had been running his own operation the whole time, and I was just finding out what my role had been. Patricia stood up fast enough to knock her chair back. This is ridiculous. I've been running this company for 6 months, successfully. You've been managing day-to-day operations, Jim corrected, his voice steady as bedrock, under the assumption that the initial will was complete. It was complete, she snapped. It was preliminary, I said, meeting her eyes across that table. Dad told me so himself, 3 days before he died. The lie came out smooth as Tennessee whiskey. Sometimes mission success requires strategic deception, and I'd learned that lesson in places where telling the truth could get good people killed. Dad never told me about any second will. Hell, we barely spoke those last few years. But Patricia didn't know that, and right now, psychological advantage was everything. Tommy leaned forward, his face pale under the conference room lights. Mac, what are you saying? I'm saying Dad spent his whole life building this company on handshakes and honor. He wanted to see if we'd remember that after he was gone. The truth was more complicated than that. Of course, Dad and I had our final conversation in the hospital 3 days before the heart attack that took him. Not about wills or company succession, but about something that had been eating at both of us for 15 years. You think I don't understand why you left, he'd said, looking smaller than I'd ever seen him in that hospital bed. But I do understand. I just wish I'd been man enough to tell you that before now. We talked about Mom then, about how she'd made him promise to let his boys choose their own paths, even if those paths led away from the family business. About how Patricia had pushed him to cut me out of the will entirely after I'd missed his 70th birthday party because of a deployment to the Mediterranean. She doesn't understand, he'd said. Doesn't understand that a man who won't serve something bigger than himself isn't worth much as a man. I never got to tell him I'd been planning to come home after my tour was up. Never got to explain that I'd learned everything I needed to learn about leadership and honor, and I was ready to apply those lessons to the family business. The heart attack took him before we could have that conversation, but sitting in that conference room watching Patricia's carefully constructed authority starting to crack, I realized maybe Dad had understood more than either of us knew. Patricia's face had gone white as fresh concrete. Jim, open that envelope. Now, are you certain? Jim asked. Once opened, these instructions become immediately binding under Connecticut probate law. She looked around the table, searching for support. Tommy was staring at his hands like he was seeing them for the first time. Eddie had stopped smiling entirely. Uncle Dermot was watching everything with the kind of careful attention he usually reserved for reading blueprint specifications. Open it, she said. Jim broke the seal with the kind of reverence he might show opening a Bible. The papers inside were thick, expensive stock, the kind Dad always used for the most important contracts. Jim unfolded them slowly, read silently for what felt like an hour but was probably 30 seconds. Finally, he looked up. The will contains what's called a conduct provision, he said. Any family member who demonstrates disrespect for military service, dishonors the founder's values, or treats returning family members as unwelcome at official family business proceedings. He paused, letting the weight of those words settle over the room like dust from a demolition. Immediately forfeits all claims to leadership positions and company benefits. Tommy's chair creaked as he shifted his weight, and Mac's military service qualifies him for protection under this clause. Patricia's refusal to shake his hand in front of witnesses with legal recording in progress. Jim looked directly at her, triggers immediate transfer of controlling interest. The silence that followed was the kind you hear right before a building comes down. Complete. Final. Uncle Dermot spoke for the first time since I'd entered the room. How much controlling interest? 68%. Patricia grabbed the edge of the table hard enough to make her knuckles go white. That's not legal. You can't just transfer ownership based on a handshake. It's ironclad, Jim said, adjusting his glasses. Your father spent 2 years working with 3 different law firms to make sure every detail was bulletproof. The conduct provision was his idea, but the implementation required some of the finest legal minds in the state. I stood up then, letting 2 decades of military discipline show in every movement. Shoulders back, spine straight, hands steady. The bearing of a man who'd stood watch on the deck of a destroyer in hostile waters and never flinched. The mission parameters have changed, I said. using the kind of voice that carries across a ship's deck in a storm. "Patricia, you're relieved of command." She looked around that table one more time, desperate now, searching for someone who might stand with her against this sudden reversal of fortune. She found nothing but family members calculating their own positions in this new reality. "You can't just walk back in here after 15 years and take over," she said. But the fight was already going out of her voice. "I'm not taking over," I replied. "I'm accepting the responsibility Dad left me." Tommy finally found his voice. "Mac, she's still family." That word hung in the air between us like smoke from a grass fire. Family. It meant different things to different people around that table. To Tommy, it meant protection from consequences. To Patricia, it had meant a ticket to easy money and social status. To Dad, apparently, it had meant something worth testing. "Family respects family," I said, keeping my voice level. She had her chance to show respect. She chose not to. Uncle Dermot cleared his throat, the sound like gravel in a cement mixer. "What's the plan, Mac?" I'd been ready for this question since I got the call about Dad's death. 23 months of thinking about it during late-night watches on the destroyer USS Hampton, staring out at dark water and wondering what kind of man walks away from his father's legacy for 20 years only to inherit it in the end. "We go back to what worked," I said. "Infrastructure projects, government contracts, and we treat every handshake like it matters, because it does." The plan was more detailed than that, of course. I'd spent months researching the company's current position, its competitors, its opportunities. Sullivan Construction was solid, but playing it safe under Patricia's leadership. Conservative bids, familiar projects, no risks. It was a strategy that could keep the lights on but would never grow the company into what Grandpa Seamus had dreamed it could become. My phone buzzed against my chest. Text message. I glanced down just long enough to read it. "Security team is in the parking lot," I said. "Former Marines. They're here to escort you off the property." Patricia's mouth opened and closed like she was trying to speak underwater. "You planned this." "Dad planned this," I corrected. "I'm just following orders." The irony wasn't lost on me. After 20 years of following orders in the Navy, my final mission was to carry out instructions from a dead man who'd spent most of my adult life disappointed in my choices. But maybe that's what family really meant, not protection from consequences, but the chance to prove yourself worthy of the legacy you've inherited. The conference room door opened, and two men in dark suits stepped in. I recognized the type immediately. Military bearing, alert eyes, the kind of controlled movement that comes from years of training. The taller one had the build of a former linebacker. The shorter one moved with the careful precision of someone who'd spent time in places where attention to detail meant the difference between coming home and coming home in a box. "Ma'am," the taller one said to Patricia, his voice respectful but unmistakably firm, "we're here to help you gather your personal items." Patricia looked at me with something close to hatred. "This isn't over." "Yes," I said quietly. "It is." She left without another word. The Marines followed her out, their footsteps echoing in the hallway like a funeral march. The room stayed quiet for a long moment after the door closed. You could hear the heating systems cycling, the distant sound of construction equipment starting up in the yard, the normal sounds of a business day beginning. Finally, Tommy spoke. "So what now?" "Now we get back to work," I said, "and we do it the way Dad and Grandpa would have wanted." Eddie, who hadn't said a word since the envelope was opened, finally found his voice. "What about our jobs?" It was a fair question. Eddie ran the equipment maintenance division, kept millions of dollars worth of earth movers and concrete trucks running smoothly. Good at his job, but he'd gotten there through family connections rather than working his way up from the ground level like most of our supervisors. "Everyone gets evaluated on merit," I said. "Family name gets you a fair chance, but it doesn't guarantee you a position you haven't earned." Uncle Dermot smiled for the first time that day. It was the kind of smile that had been waiting 40 years to show itself. "Welcome home, Mac," he said. I walked over to Dad's portrait and placed the white rose on the small shelf underneath. The photo had been taken 5 years earlier at the company's 50th anniversary celebration. Dad in his best suit, standing in front of the headquarters building he'd expanded 3 times over the decades. He looked proud in that photo, proud of what he and Uncle Dermot and Grandpa Seamus had built together. "Mission accomplished, Dad," I said quietly. Jim Hendricks was gathering his papers, preparing to leave. "There are some administrative details we'll need to handle," he said. "Transfer of signatory authority, board notifications, that sort of thing. How long?" I asked. 72 hours for the essentials. The rest will sort itself out over the next few weeks, and Patricia's legal options." Jim shook his head. "Non-existent. Your father was very thorough. He anticipated every possible challenge and closed every loophole. I've never seen more comprehensive estate planning in 30 years of practice." After Jim left, it was just family in that room. Tommy, Eddie, Uncle Dermot, and me. 4 men looking at each other across a table that had seen 3 generations of Sullivan family meetings. "I know you're all wondering what kind of boss I'm going to be," I said. "So let me make it simple. Work hard, treat people right, and remember that this company's name is on every paycheck for 800 families. Those families are counting on us to make smart decisions and honor our commitments." Tommy nodded slowly. "And if we don't, then you'll find out what Patricia just found out. Respect isn't negotiable, and consequences aren't optional." Uncle Dermot stood up, walked over to the window that looked out over the equipment yard. "Your father would be proud," he said. "Took him 40 years to figure out what you learned in the Navy? What's that? That leadership isn't about having the biggest office or the loudest voice. It's about being willing to make the hard choices when they need to be made." Outside, I could see Patricia's Mercedes leaving the parking lot, probably for the last time. 2 decades of military service had taught me that every ending was also a beginning, every mission completion was preparation for the next objective. Sullivan Construction was about to find out what that looked like. That evening, I called my old commanding officer, Captain Rodriguez, told him about the company, about the veteran hiring program we'd be starting, about the opportunity to give good men and women a chance to build something that would outlast us all. "Sounds like you found your next mission," he said. "Roger that, sir. The transformation didn't happen overnight. Nothing worthwhile ever does. But it started the next morning when I walked into Dad's office for the first time as the man in charge. I'd kept everything exactly the way he'd left it. The photos of construction projects spanning 5 decades, the handwritten thank you letters from workers whose families had been helped through hard times, the framed copy of Grandpa Seamus's first business license issued in 1962 when he was still learning English and teaching himself to read blueprints. The first order of business was a company-wide meeting. All 800 employees, from the newest apprentices to the veteran foreman who'd worked alongside Dad for 20 years. I stood in front of that group in the main assembly hall and told them exactly what they could expect from Sullivan Construction going forward. "We're going back to our roots," I said. "Infrastructure projects that make communities stronger, government contracts that serve the public good, and a workplace where every person is treated with the respect they've earned through honest work." The response was immediate. Nods of approval from the older workers who remembered when the company operated that way. Cautious optimism from the younger ones who'd never experienced anything but Patricia's bottom-line focused management style. Within 3 months, we'd landed the biggest infrastructure contract in company history. Highway expansion project that would employ 400 people for 2 years, stretching from Hartford to New Haven. I made sure 30% of those jobs went to veterans, men and women who understood the value of mission completion and taking care of your team. The results spoke for themselves. Project completed 2 weeks ahead of schedule, 8% under budget, 0 safety incidents. The kind of performance that gets noticed in industry publications and government procurement offices. Tommy stayed on as operations manager, but he had to earn the position all over again. Turned out he was pretty good at the work when he wasn't spending half his time worrying about family politics and office maneuvering. He learned to read blueprints the way Grandpa Seamus had taught Dad, learned to talk to workers the way Uncle Dermot had always done, with respect for their experience and gratitude for their labor. Uncle Dermot became our community relations director, handling the relationships Dad had built over 4 decades with union leaders, local politicians, and other contractors. His deep knowledge of the business and genuine care for working families made him invaluable in ways that went far beyond any job description. Patricia tried to challenge the will in court, just like I knew she would. Lasted exactly 6 weeks before her lawyer sat her down and explained that Dad's planning had been thorough enough to survive any legal challenge she could afford to mount. The conduct clause was ironclad, the witnesses were unimpeachable, and the recording was crystal clear. The company grew by 40% that first year, not because we revolutionized the construction industry or invented new ways of building highways and bridges, but because we went back to doing things the right way. Every contract honored, every worker treated fairly, every handshake backed up with action. I kept Dad's office exactly as he'd left it, but I added one thing, a small wooden plaque on his desk, something I'd picked up at the Navy Exchange before my discharge. It read, "The price of greatness is responsibility." Some mornings I'd sit in there with my coffee and think about the conversation we never got to finish, about duty and family, and what it means to serve something bigger than yourself, about how the lessons I'd learned on the deck of a destroyer in the Persian Gulf weren't so different from the ones Grandpa Seamus had learned building his first foundation in the Connecticut dirt. Dad had known I'd come home eventually. He just made sure I'd have something worth coming home to, and the character necessary to handle it properly. The white rose I'd brought to that first meeting dried out after a couple of weeks, but I replaced it every month. Small gesture, but gestures matter. They're how you show respect for what came before and commitment to what comes next. These days, when someone new joins Sullivan Construction, I make sure to shake their hand first thing. Look them in the eye. Let them know they belong here, that their work matters, that the company's success depends on their commitment to excellence. It's a simple thing, but simple things build strong foundations. And in this business, foundations are everything. The lesson I carry forward is permanent and straightforward. Respect isn't something you earn after you prove yourself worthy. It's the cost of entry. It's what you give first before you know anything else about a person, because that's how you find out what kind of person they really are. Dad understood that. Grandpa Seamus had built a company on that principle. They just needed someone who'd learned the same lesson in places where getting it wrong meant people didn't come home. Now it's my turn to keep building one honest handshake at a time. Listen, if you're a man who spent decades working with your hands, serving your country, or building something that'll outlast you, then you already know what I'm talking about. You've seen what happens when people forget that respect and honor aren't old-fashioned ideas. They're the foundation everything else stands on. You've watched good organizations fall apart when leadership starts thinking they're above the principles that built the place. But here's what I learned that day in the conference room. It's never too late to demand better. From your family, from your workplace, from the people who think they can treat you like you don't matter. The principles you learned in the service, on the job site, or in your father's workshop, those principles still work. They still matter. And when you stand up for them, when you refuse to accept less than what you've earned through decades of honest work, people notice. So the next time someone refuses to shake your hand, remember this: that's not your problem to solve. That's their character being revealed for everyone to see. Your job is to stand firm, stay professional, and let consequences teach the lessons that words never could. Semper Fi,